Welcome to the fifth plenary session of this 15th Manama Dialogue. If I could ask the people who are near the door to usher in as many people who are within its perimeter into the room. There hasn't been, as I said earlier, a session of this Manama Dialogue where the U.S. role hasn't in one fashion or another been referred to, and that's why I think it's very important that we have assembled this cast to talk about the U.S. policy in the Middle East and alliance relations, about which so many questions have been asked and so many comments already made. I was just noting with our colleagues now on stage that we had managed to assemble two branches of the executive, two branches of the U.S. government, the executive branch and the legislative branch, and I did reassure them that I had no special intent of having a member of the judiciary as well on this panel. It was good enough, I thought, to have one representative from the executive branch and two from the legislative branch, and happily evenly divided between the House of Representatives and the Senate. And we all observe with keen interest the internal debates in all the countries that have an interest in the region, and the United States as much as any other, and know the important role that the U.S. Congress plays in developing and affirming and authorizing U.S. international policy. And of course, it's in the U.S. Department of Defense that policy is made, and it's from the DoD that so much of the security relationship with this region is managed. So it's fantastic that we have these three figures with us. We want to end at 5:29 so as to allow those of you who are going to the dinner to be able to board the transport at 5:45. And there are one or two bilaterals that follow immediately after this plenary, which people need to attend. So I'll be strict on timings. Thank you, all of you, for joining us for this fifth plenary after a long day. And what I will do, again, is to ask the three individuals on the program to speak in the order in which they appear: John Rood, Chris Murphy, Joe Wilson. So could we begin first with Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, John Rood. Thank you very much.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you, Dr. Chipman, for that introduction. And also, I should say, Dr. Chipman, thank you for the kind friendship that you have shown to the U.S. Department of Defense over the years, and we very much appreciate that, sir. It's great to be with you here in Manama Dialogue and to talk about the U.S. commitment to this region and all of the ways that we have been here for quite a long time. And I'll discuss in my remarks some of the things that we're doing to reaffirm that partnership that we think is so important. Now, of course, this gathering right here would not have been possible without the vision and leadership of King Hamad and Crown Prince Salman, who in 2004 first welcomed IISS to Manama, and I believe, Dr. Chipman, at that time you called it the Gulf Dialogue. During the late Emir of Bahrain's 1983 visit to the White House to see President Ronald Reagan, His Highness Sheikh Issa bin Salman and President Ronald Reagan discussed the then nascent Gulf Cooperation Council to show the significance of partnership and the regional cooperation in promoting stability and dealing with shared threats in this region. And these partnerships are nothing new to the United States. As early as 1790, just after the United States was founded, Oman received the first U.S. ship called the Boston Rambler into port. And in 1840, the Sultan's envoy sailed to New York, becoming the first Arab diplomat to be accredited to the United States. Day in and day out, the U.S. Department of Defense leads by example by engaging with our partners in this region. In World War II, Bahrain opened up its ports to American sailors and airmen going to fight in World War II. And in 1945, American President Franklin Delano Roosevelt hosted Saudi King Abdulaziz aboard a U.S. Navy destroyer in the Suez Canal for our first governmental meeting with the Saudis. And throughout the 1950s, we concluded our earliest mutual defense assistance agreements with Egypt, Pakistan, and Saudi Arabia. Since then, we have cultivated over 250 defense agreements with our friends here in this region, which complement the 8 significant bases the United States maintains in the region. Of note, Bahrain graciously welcomed the U.S. Navy's Central Command headquarters in 1995, and we have enjoyed a strong partnership ever since. General McKenzie, our able commander of Central Command, is of course here, and the commander of NAVCENT, Admiral Malloy, is also here. This region in particular inherently understands what the United States has known since 1790, that a stable world requires a stable Middle East. When left unchecked, aggressive regimes and malign actors undermine the stability. They threaten not only individual nations, but the rules-based international order. Since 1945, this order has fostered and underpinned global economic growth, stability, and dialogue. But we must never take it for granted. As Secretary of Defense Mark Esper said last month, quote, "There is no inherent permanence to this system," end quote. Like-minded nations must work to preserve and protect it against aggressive actors that prioritize malign desires and their goals at the expense of this rules-based international order. Today, we encounter challenges not unlike those that were faced in the decades since 1945. We must counter these trends by fulfilling the words of a much-admired U.S. Secretary of State and Defense, George Marshall, who in the wake of World War II declared that, quote, "The only way human beings win a war is to prevent it," end quote. For the United States, the role we play as a partner is critical. For the Defense Department, this means working with regional and global partners to identify efficient and effective means to advance our shared objectives, and we recognize that building partner capacity is a journey, not a specific destination. Now, I'd like to spend a few moments on 3 key challenges facing the United States and our partners here in the Middle East. The first I'd like to highlight is the fight to defeat Daesh, or ISIS. The United States has rallied together 81 nations and international organizations for the Defeat ISIS Coalition, which has fought successfully in close partnership with our Iraqi security force partners and our partners in Syria, the Syrian Democratic Forces. The coalition freed 100% of ISIS-held territory. It liberated 7.7 million people from the brutal rule of ISIS. And at the hands of U.S. Special Operations Forces, it took down ISIS leader Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, and days later, one of his top deputies. This global coalition reflects the partnerships the United States spearheads and exemplifies how international coalition and collaboration can stabilize the region. Recently, President Trump reaffirmed that the enduring defeat of ISIS remains a core priority for the U.S. military. Together with our coalition partners, we will continue to inflict maximum damage on the remnants of ISIS, including denying ISIS access to the oil fields in Syria from which they used to generate revenue. Toward that end, the United States will retain a force in eastern Syria, and we will maintain our presence at Tanif Garrison along Syria's border with Jordan. In Iraq, the United States is committed to building the capacity of the Iraqi security forces to ensure they are well equipped to defend against terrorist and other destabilizing threats that pose a long-term threat to Iraq and the region. U.S. forces have been training Iraqi security forces to counter ISIS since 2015, and in the last quarter of this year alone, the U.S.-led coalition expects to have trained 15,000 members of the Iraqi security forces. We have built on our progress by transitioning to a train-the-trainer approach so the Iraqis can pass on their learned experience to new generations. In addition, we support NATO's Mission Iraq and its efforts to reform the Iraqi security sector. Even as we eliminate ISIS's so-called caliphate, the United States and our partners must acknowledge a different kind of instability, That's one coming from Iran, and that's the second challenge I'll focus on this afternoon. In the last 6 months alone, Iran has sought to disrupt the freedom of navigation and the global economy and destabilize its neighbors through direct attacks and through its proxies in Yemen, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq. The United States remains focused on an economic and diplomatic maximum pressure campaign that has continued to achieve its objectives since 2018. Despite its leadership's bluster to the contrary, the heavy economic toll that this campaign is taking on the Iranian economy is undeniable. The International Monetary Fund has assessed that Iran's economy will contract by 9.5% in the coming year. While Iran has already seen the inflation rate grow to between 31 and 35%, has lost 60% of its currency's value against the dollar, and has been forced to cut 28% of its defense budget, thereby cutting 17% of its support to the IRGC, or Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. This no doubt affects the operations of its regional proxies. At the same time, President Trump has made clear the United States stands ready to meet the Iranians at the negotiating table. Unfortunately, with this May's attacks on tankers transiting the Strait of Hormuz and Tehran's attack on Aramco oil facilities in Saudi Arabia, Iran has made clear its intent to pursue a pattern of aggressive behavior that is destabilizing. These attacks are not merely a regional or U.S. problem, they're a threat to global security and the global economy. This necessitates an international response, and the United States has met this call to succeed by internationalizing the response through the International Maritime Security Construct and supports the regional integrated air and missile defense effort led by Saudi Arabia. Headquartered here in Manama, the IMSC, or International Maritime Security Construct, has sought to deter malign activity and help promote maritime security by ensuring freedom of navigation and the free flow of commerce through the Arabian Gulf, the Strait of Hormuz, the Bab el-Mandab, and the Gulf of Oman. And as our coalition diversifies from including Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Bahrain, the UK, Albania, and Australia, it becomes easier to maintain stability. As an additional effort to bring stability to the skies and counter Iran's demonstrable threat of ballistic missiles, Secretary of Defense Esper announced the deployment of U.S. forces such as bombers, airborne intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance capabilities, maritime patrol aircraft, cruisers, and the Abraham Lincoln Carrier Battle Group, including destroyers and fighter aircraft carried aboard it. Since May of 2019, the deployment of approximately 14,000 additional U.S. forces is aimed at deterring Iranian aggression and providing the U.S. with a formidable array of capabilities to defend against and, if necessary, forcefully respond to Iranian aggression. As President FDR, or Franklin Delano Roosevelt, said, quote, "Peace, like war, can succeed only where there is a will to enforce it and where there is available power to enforce it," end quote. These deployments augment the considerable capabilities of our partners here in the region and are a demonstrable indication that we will have available power to enforce our will to promote stability in this region. Now, I would say parenthetically, there's been some discussion at the conference about whether the United States wished to disengage from the region, whether there was a smaller U.S. commitment to the Middle East. And what I would point out is just in the last 6 months alone, there are at least 14,000 reasons why our commitment remains very strong here. Those 14,000 additional forces were not present here a few months ago. And in fact, since we have launched our new national defense strategy, which spoke of an importance of the Pacific, the Indo-Pacific region, the United States has continued to grow its military presence in this region. And so I think the facts are important here. The facts are important to show where we are operating. The facts are important to show where we are devoting additional resources. And the facts are important where we're collaborating successfully with others around the world to address our shared interest in promoting stability and deterring aggression in this area. As I mentioned, Tehran and its proxies have demonstrated both the capability and the intent to use their missile arsenal as a tool of regional coercion. I will say that the THAAD battery and Patriot missile defense batteries that we have been deploying will help counter Tehran and its proxies' attempts to use their missiles as a tool of aggression and coercion. As President Trump has clearly stated, and I would point out despite these military moves, our president has been clear the United States does not seek war with Iran. Yet I would also remind Iran's leaders that they should not mistake the restraint that the United States has shown to be a lack of will or resolve on our part. We are dedicated to ensuring our partners have the capabilities to address threats in addition to those that are posed by Iran and its proxies, such as piracy in their territorial waters. And this is evidenced by the counter-piracy task force that Bahrain commanded last year. We seek to ensure they have the training and equipment necessary to counter terrorist threats to their sovereignty and also to track and defeat UAV threats, which have grown. We encourage our partners to take responsibility for their security, and America's longstanding investment is emblematic of this. Between 2015 and 2019 alone, the United States invested about $74 million in the training of 3,200 personnel working in national security in this region. U.S. arms bolster unrivaled global coalitions, and our products remain the most advanced and trusted military products in the world. Over the last 5 years, U.S. foreign military sales have totaled $132 billion in this region alone. Here today, General McKenzie can attest to how busy we are. He regularly engages with about 180 key leaders in this region in 1 year alone. More broadly, over the course of this year, we participate in a staggering number of exercises. We will do over 40 military exercises in this region alone, with dozens of participating partners. As just one example, the annual IMX naval exercise brought together 47 nations, 6 international organizations, 5,000 personnel, 40 naval vessels. We had 34 search and seizure teams, 19 explosive ordnance disposal teams, and 17 aircraft participate in that one exercise. As Winston Churchill once quipped, quote, "One always measures friendships by how they show up in bad weather," end quote. If the last 6 months have shown anything, it's that U.S. forces are showing up in greater and greater numbers in the region as the weather has become stormier. The United States does not profess to be perfect, and most certainly we don't get everything right all the time. But our partners know what we stand for. Our partners know our values, and our partners know they can count on us now and in the future. I would also add that over the decades, America's adversaries, whether they be Saddam Hussein's regime, Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda, or Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi and his ISIS followers, they've also seen what America stands for. They have seen our values in action. They've seen what America will do, and they've seen that America will be with our partners and allies when it counts. In this context, it's worthwhile to draw a contrast with some of the opportunistic behavior we're seeing in this region, and as we see some other actors choose to try to take advantage of what they see as a potential opening. As our partners pursue opportunities for external trade and investment in their economies and infrastructure, the United States encourages them to consider the risks and track record of states such as Russia and China. We encourage them to consider their assistance to the murderous Assad regime in Syria and the regime in Tehran that intently pursues malign activities throughout the region. And we encourage the region to consider with clear eyes the predatory economic model that China is promoting as it pursues new projects. Quote, "No foreign policy, no matter how ingenious, has any chance of success if it is born in the minds of a few and carried in the hearts of none," said Henry Kissinger. World War II made abundantly clear that while few men can do it alone, certainly few nations can carry the burden of global security alone. So in conclusion, let me just leave you with our vision of the Middle East. One that is stable, one that is prosperous, one that is not dominated by any malign actor or power or group, and one that is rooted in the international rules-based order. Accordingly, the United States is continuing to enhance our partnerships, including through an integrated Gulf Cooperation Council. And going forward, the United States will work closely with the countries in this region, our partners, to continue to make this vision of stability and peace a reality. So thank you very much for the chance to talk to you today.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Secretary Rood. And I know we'll want to discuss further in the debate period that careful balance between deterrence, defense, and diplomacy that U.S. engagement in the region no doubt requires. Thank you very much. And could I now ask Senator Murphy, the ranking member of the Subcommittee on Near East, South Asia, Central Asia, and Counterterrorism of the U.S. Senate, to address us.
Thank you very much, John. Thank you to our hosts and all the individuals that put on this important conference. This is my first time here, and thank you for welcoming me and our delegation. Pleased to be joined here by Representative Ted Deutsch of Florida, and you will hear from Representative Joe Wilson of South Carolina shortly. Thank you to our country hosts, to the Kingdom for hosting not just this conference, but the Fifth Fleet and the thousands of Americans who come through here, protecting you, the region, and our security interests. We appreciate your hospitality to the American military. Let me reiterate what Secretary Rood laid down as an important predicate, and that is the vital importance of this region to the United States. I'm going to be candid with you in my remarks and in answers to questions about my belief that this is a very perilous moment, a moment where there is reason to be nervous about the commitment of the United States to this region, but I'm also going to try to take my time to explain that I believe there still remains a bipartisan consensus around the importance not just to stay engaged, but to re-engage, to up the ante when it comes to U.S. participation in this region. But the importance of us being here is maybe very, very critical to say at this moment. We still have thousands of U.S. troops. We're still spending billions of dollars in this region engaged in our collective security. It is still the oil and gas that is produced here that powers the world economy. It's still very important to the United States and our interest. Trillions of dollars of commerce pass through the waterways of this region, vital to us and all of our economic partners around the world. There are still extremist groups that continue to threaten the United States and nations that ultimately support those groups, Iran at the very top of that list. And most importantly, we have friends and allies here sitting in this room today that have fought with us and died with us in our fights for our collective security. We know that a safe America and a stable world requires a stable and safe Middle East. And while this is a moment of angst and uncertainty, there still exists in our country a bipartisan consensus around the need to be here. Now, that being said, this is a very difficult moment. I am a very vocal critic of this administration's foreign policy, and it is a time to admit that many in this region are not sure if the United States is coming or going. It is very difficult for capable career public servants to set policy in this administration when their hard work and labor done over the course of months and years can be undone by a presidential tweet. No one knows what our policy is going to be from day to day, and it's very difficult to get to a negotiating table with the United States not knowing what our bottom line is going to be. I think it would be silly for us not to acknowledge that it is a very difficult moment to understand the bottom lines of American foreign policy. But I think what is most important for me to say to you today, frankly, as a Democrat who ran for Congress on a platform of getting the United States militarily unentangled from the war in Iraq, it's important for me to underscore to you that there remains this consensus amongst both parties, even at this incredibly politically volatile moment in Washington, about the need to both learn from our lessons when it comes to the mistakes that we have made here in the region, our over-reliance on the blunt force of military power to try to settle complicated political dynamics in the region, and to invent new ways to be partners with all of you in our communal efforts, our collective efforts to bring stability to this region and to the world. And I just want to lay out for you some of the places in which I think that that consensus exists. First, on the question of Iraq. I do believe that Republicans and Democrats in the United States Congress believe that we need to communicate in as clear a set of terms as possible that we have a long-term commitment to the security of Iraq. And that has to come not just through continued military aid, but a recognition that we ask the Iraqis to engage in a campaign against ISIS, which has left much of that country in shambles. And there's no way for the United States to now walk away from the rebuilding effort after that very destructive campaign to rid the nation of ISIS accrued to the national security benefit of the United States. We need to re-engage. We need to make clear that our commitment to Iraq is long-term. It worries me to watch this administration pulling our diplomatic presence out of Baghdad at a moment when we should be doubling and tripling our diplomatic and economic and reconstruction aid to that nation. I do believe that there remains a bipartisan belief in Washington about a long-term renewed commitment to Iraqi security and reconstruction. Second, when it comes to the conflict in Yemen, I'm heartened to hear, as we have sat here today, good news, perhaps the grass tips of some beginnings of a serious political process. But the United States needs to be at the middle of that process. There is no realistic way for a long-term political deal to happen without the United States being, if not at the center of those discussions, on the first outer ring of the periphery. And so my hope is that Republicans and Democrats together will be able to push America to get back into the middle of that process. Good news, but more good news can be had if the United States is back and re-engaged. Third, when it comes to the future of American policy versus Iran, I obviously was a supporter of the JCPOA. I think it was a mistake to pull out of that agreement, but we now have to be together in Washington about the terms upon which we re-engage with Iran. If we are indeed going to require that as part of a new set of negotiations, Iran puts more on the table than just their nuclear program, then let's make sure that that is a realistic set of objectives that we are seeking Iran to come to the table on. I worry that we have set a bar so high that it is going to be difficult to ultimately gain any foothold of success. But I think Republicans and Democrats can agree that we need Iran to not just get back to the table on the disposition of their nuclear program, but to bring their malevolent support for proxy groups, their ballistic missile program, and their domestic campaign of political repression to that table as well. But let's have a consensus around a realistic set of objectives that we are seeking to effectuate through a political and diplomatic process. Democrats and Republicans, I think, can come to an agreement on that as well. I think there is also general agreement that the United States, well, perhaps over time lessening our military presence in the Middle East, can replace that with a surge in diplomatic presence and economic aid. There's no reason why we can't be a much bigger player when it comes to the continued efforts to try to bring economic stability to parts of this region that are seeking to gain it. We shouldn't be rolling back our diplomatic presence in places like Baghdad. We should be staffing up. Easy things like exchange programs can be expanded in many of these countries. The U.S. development finance capacity can be much more adeptly deployed deployed in many parts of this region. There are all sorts of ways in which we can be economic, diplomatic partners in this region, and we should have that kind of surge throughout the region. And then lastly, we should have a consistency of effort when it comes to our support for self-determination, democracy promotion, and human rights. It's not an all or nothing proposition. We certainly understand that different countries in the region are going to move at different speeds when it comes to opening up space for political dissent or minority rights or women's ability to participate in political space or economic space. But there does need to be an element of every bilateral relationship that involves the U.S. advocacy for these causes. Again, it's not an all or nothing proposition, but that needs to be an element of our policy in this region, and there is clear bipartisan consensus on that subject as well. And so while I certainly am one of the more vocal critics of the way in which this administration has caused much of the world to ask questions about how committed we are, I also believe that despite the rancor you may see every day on television as impeachment proceedings move through the House and potentially to the Senate, Democrats and Republicans in Washington today believe that U.S. participation and involvement in the Middle East is absolutely vital to our national security interests. We understand that it is time for us to learn from our mistakes of the past. We understand that our presence here may look different than it did 20 years ago. But there is no disagreement, almost no disagreement, between the two parties on our need to be present here for the long term. And that is, I hope, the message that both sides of the aisle are bringing here as part of our delegation to this very, very important conference. I look forward to the discussion this afternoon.
Senator, thank you very much for two things: for that realistic set of objectives on any new negotiation with Iran on which bipartisan domestic consensus can be won, and also for your call for a surge of economic and diplomatic statecraft. So it's a real pleasure now to have Congressman Joe Wilson address us, who is the ranking member of the Subcommittee on Middle East, North Africa, and International Terrorism of the Committee on Foreign Affairs of the U.S. House of Representatives. Thank you, sir.
And ladies and gentlemen, I'm very grateful personally to be here with you. My father served in the Flying Tigers 70 years ago on behalf of the people of India and China, and my four sons have served on behalf of the people of Iraq, Egypt, and Afghanistan, developing a great affection for the people of the Middle East. Thank you for the International Institute for Strategic Studies for organizing this impressive security conference and for inviting me to speak today on U.S. policy and alliance relations in the Middle East. We are very fortunate to be here today in the capital of a long-time appreciated ally, Bahrain, to discuss some of the most pressing issues to international security today. Manama is especially appropriate location to discuss the topic of the panel U.S. policy in the Middle East. The history of America's relationship with the island nation of Bahrain stretches back to even before 1903, with the establishment of the American Mission Hospital in Manama. This was the beginning of a deep and enduring friendship between the people of both the United States and Bahrain, and between the governments in Washington and Manama. With fast forward to today, and the strong ties that bind our nations are perhaps best represented by the presence of the U.S. Navy's 5th Fleet headquarters here in Bahrain. The U.S. Navy has been fortunate to have a presence in Bahrain since World War II, with the posting officially recognized as the U.S. Middle East Force from 1948. It goes without saying, Bahrain is a valued U.S. ally, which added and was very significant in our victory in the Cold War with the liberation of Central and Eastern Europe and Central Asia. In many ways, Bahrain represents a hope for the Middle East. While challenges persist, here Sunni, Shiite, Christian, Jewish, and Hindu communities of faith live together and flourish. It is a model of unity too often troubled by sectarian and confessional divisions. I appreciate that President Donald Trump has made this vision that Bahrain is so greatly represents a cornerstone of his foreign policy for the region. President Trump's first international trip was to Riyadh, where 40 Gulf Cooperation Council and Muslim countries publicly agreed on the need to counter extremism. President Trump has proven his dedication to the region by his actions. The journey is far from complete, but this step was unprecedented and positive. President Trump has also inaugurated a ministerial to advance religious freedom to foster international communication to ensure greater respect for religious freedom. And we see, too, that we've seen further progress under the leadership of President Trump in the relations between the State of Israel and its Arab neighbors. Look no further than Bahrain. Once again, this past June, I was especially pleased to receive news of the positive comments of Bahraini Foreign Minister Sheikh Khalid Al Khalifa regarding and relating to Israel and a desire for better relations with the Jewish state. It is amazing, this progress, as many here in the audience well know. This is a statement that no one would have anticipated even a few years ago for the actual mutual benefit of all. But the fact remains that one of the biggest threats to the U.S. interest and the interest of our allies in the region is Iranian plots for hegemony in the region. No one can contest that Iran is a malign actor, fomenting destabilization and terrorism throughout the region and the broader world. That is why it's so imperative that President Trump withdrew from the flawed nuclear deal which gave the mullahs in Tehran the breathing room and incredible financial resources to double down on malign activities such as missile development. And no one understands this better than perhaps our friends right here in Manama. Iran has been sponsoring terrorism here for decades and is perhaps the greatest security threat to the Gulf region. That's why I was grateful that this administration also took the necessary step to designate the Iranian Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps for what it is, a foreign terrorist organization. That undoubtedly came as good news to our allies here in the Gulf, and so did the Trump administration's designation of the Ashtar Brigades, an Iranian proxy militia right here in Bahrain that has launched dozens of murderous attacks against Bahraini security forces. This pressure on Iran has yielded concrete dividends on the ground here in the Middle East. U.S. sanctions have disrupted and slowed Iran's ability to provide oil to its Syrian client, the criminal Assad regime. The Syrian people will also never forget that it was the Trump administration that finally enforced the previous administration's red line, striking twice for the use of chemical weapons against civilians. Sanctions in Iran have also affected Tehran's sponsorship of regional terrorism. Reports have indicated that Iran has had to slash payments to fighters in Syria by a third due to the pain of the American sanctions. Even employees of Hezbollah have missed paycheck and lost perks. The administration has also taken the bold move of designating major Iranian militias for terrorism, including Najuba in Iraq and the brigades of Afghan and Pakistani mercenaries Iran has been exploiting as cheap fodder in Syria's bloody war. Sanctions have also seriously hampered Iran's economy, ultimately contributing to the mass protests that we are witnessing in Iran today. The people of Iran deserve the freedom and democracy reflected in their own extraordinary culture and heritage. Some may say we're overly focused on Iran. I would have to respectfully disagree. The people of the Middle East, I believe, would have to disagree. We are seeing protests in Lebanon and Iraq today that explicitly demand Iran cease its stranglehold on their political systems. The courageous people of Iran are demanding that their rulers stop spending millions of dollars abroad to support tyrants and foment terrorism. The United States must do more, in my opinion, to send a strong message of support to the people of the region yearning for increased human rights and democracy. The Middle East today is brimming with potential. In the past year alone, we have witnessed citizens in Sudan, Egypt, Algeria, and most recently Iraq, Iran, and Lebanon take to the streets and give expression to their democratic aspirations. We have just recently returned from a trip to Tunis, Tunisia, where I was inspired to see firsthand a view of an impressive new Middle Eastern democracy in action. I am a lifelong supporter of President Ronald Reagan's maxim of peace through strength, and I believe this is exactly the message of the Trump administration to be projecting. President Trump has significantly increased defense spending to enhance our capabilities to project power and secure vital interests around the world. As a member of the Congress and ranking member of the Middle East and North Africa Subcommittee on the Committee on Foreign Affairs of the House of Representatives with Chairman Ted Deutsch, I will do all I can to promote, as you've seen, the bipartisan U.S. role in the region. The U.S. must not cede influence to those who seek to counter the spirit of democracy and freedom in the Middle East. There is simply no substitute for U.S. partnership in the region. Thank you for inviting me to be here today, and I look forward to the panel discussion.
Congressman Wilson, many thanks for those remarks. And I know the audience will have seen the impeccable IISS logic of having one person from the executive branch and a bipartisan congressional delegation speak to us this afternoon. Again, we're now opened up for questions and comments. Remember, two-step process, put your badge in, press the button. I'll give some priority to those who hadn't yet got the floor. And so let me first ask Barry Al-Mudin.
Thank you very much, John. I have a very quick comment. I just want to say that as somebody who is in the region, although I live in the UK, I must say there is fear from the policies of the US, and nobody is happy with the US flaunting international law every time President Trump decides to give presents from the Palestinian land to his friend, Mr. Netanyahu. So let's be clear about this. I really welcome Senator Murphy's comments and his frankness. We need it. What I'd like to know from the three of you, what 3 steps you can give to assure the Lebanese and the Iraqis and the Palestinians that you can do something for the people. And I'm not talking here about government, I'm talking about the people. 3 steps for these 3 nations. Thank you.
Thank you. Simon Mayo.
Thank you very much, Chairman. I always remember during the discussions on nuclear deterrent philosophy, we always talked about capability, credibility, and communication, all 3 leading to confidence. And I certainly agree that actions do speak louder than words often. But the US rhetoric about this region since President Obama's pivot to Asia have really undermined, in my view, the effectiveness of the huge US military commitment to the region, both in the eyes of friends and allies, but I also think the misunderstanding in the direct and indirect opponents of the US presence in this region. And it definitely unsettles people. And it does strike me that the US does need a much more coherent single message. Even today, I heard Mr. Rood talk about the reinforcement of the US presence in the Gulf, and then Mr. Murphy seemed to speak about drawing down the military presence, albeit surging diplomatic reconstruction efforts. And I would just argue that the one thing you can't surge in any relationship is trust. And it would be really helpful for the US's friends and even allies in the region if the US could speak with a single voice on their long-term sustained commitment to this region. Thank you.
Maggie Feldman-Pitch.
Thank you. I want to thank all 3 speakers for your efforts, but particularly Senator Murphy for your leadership and candor today, and as a former constituent, your leadership on some homeland security issues, specifically gun reform. As someone who is focused on human capital management and competent diversity, how it impacts our decision-making and policy-making, I want to ask, where do we go from here? You mentioned the struggles of career public servants and having their policies overturned by presidential tweet. What is the role, in your mind, of Congress in rebuilding some of these institutions, and perhaps equally as importantly, if not more importantly, rebuilding the trust and relationships that we're so focused on here?
Thank you. And from the IISS, John Rain.
Thank you, John. I was very impressed by the statement of commitment militarily to the region. I had a question largely for Undersecretary Rood. Based on a 2-year study by the IISS of Iran's capability to fight through third parties, one of the conclusions being that they had done this extremely well and now enjoyed a certain strategic advantage. Do you think that whilst we are concentrating on outgunning the Iranians are concentrating on outsmarting us? And if there's new thinking about how we might disable this critical Iranian capability? Thank you.
Jacinta Carroll.
Thank you, everyone, for your very useful comments, and very necessary given the prominence of the United States in these discussions. But given that we've heard much over the last day and yesterday evening about expectations on the United States leading in this region, noting the mixed fortunes of different countries in the region and the great economic development in many, I'd just like to put back to you as representatives from the executive and from your political side, what your expectations are of your partners in the region as we move into this very complex situation, and your expectations of partners further afield. Thank you.
Thank you. Azam Zakani.
بالعربي بدي أحكي معك. شكرا.
My question is in Arabic. Good evening. I have listened to what Mr. John Rodd said when he mentioned that our vision for the Middle East is a vision of a stable and secure area, and this is great. Mr. Chris Murphy criticized the foreign policy of his country, and also this is great. We, the Palestinians, have signed the Oslo Agreement in 1993, and based on that, the PLO office has been opened. Mr. Trump has closed these offices. You have Palestinian refugees since 1948 living everywhere, and in addition to that, American assistance has been stopped, and this assistance used to assist these refugees all over the world. He recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, and it is a sacred place just after Mecca and Medina. It is one of the most sacred places for Muslims. Millions and billions of Muslims go to Jerusalem, and this is a sacred place for Muslims. He transferred the embassy from West Jerusalem to East Jerusalem, which is the expected capital of the Palestinian state. And a week ago, Pompeo said that the settlements where the expected Palestinian state is to be established are legal. And we're talking also of the annexation of Golan to Israel. Do you believe that this American policy in the Middle East will lead to stability? Do you believe it will lead to security? You have listened to the different speakers in the morning, Safadi from Jordan, the Chinese representative. Everybody is saying that the Palestinian question is at the heart of the conflict in the Middle East. Do you have a vision for resolving this issue based on a possible justice? And they are calling for establishing a Palestinian state on 22% of the historical land of Palestine. Is there an American vision to have a quasi-fair solution in order to eradicate terrorism from the Middle East? Because I believe that the question of Palestine is very important.
Alistair Byrd.
Thank you, John. It's another slant on the Palestinian question. It's to ask this. If the United States wants to continue to be seen as an honest broker in the region, and Senator Murphy spoke about the United States becoming more involved in Yemen and negotiations there, does the United States appreciate the damage that's been done to the concept of the United States as an honest broker by its actions recently in between Israel and the Palestinians, where it appears patently that the efforts of the envoy and the ambassador don't begin to address the issue of impartiality, and that makes therefore a huge difficulty for the United States allies and friends in the region who continue to promote the efforts of the envoy and the Middle East peace process being in the hands of the United States as an honest broker between the different parties, when patently that's no longer the case. And a restoration of that image of honest broker is desperately needed, not just for the issues between Israel and the Palestinians, but for the United States' reputation around the region and the work and necessity of working with allies and colleagues to achieve objects here for the benefit of all.
Shashank Joshi.
Thank you. My question's about Iran and the JCPOA, particularly for Undersecretary Rood, but also perhaps Congressman Wilson. Iran's nuclear program is now expanding again, and it recently recommenced enrichment at Fordow, albeit on a small scale. Assuming that the regime isn't bound for collapse, and assuming that there's no new arrangement and this expansion continues, as Iran has many reasons to do, what's America's plan B, and in particular, are there American red lines? Can Iran reach a certain breakout time or threshold that would prompt American military action, or is it simply that the tangible pursuit of a bomb would be that point?
Dean Allen.
Thank you, John. To Senator Murphy, you spoke of realistic objectives for re-engaging Iran. As far as I understand, the leading Democratic candidates for president have all committed to rejoining the JCPOA without renegotiation. So in the event of a Democratic victory, how do you see that playing out? Is it possible in political and other terms simply to rejoin?
Thank you. Amr Moussa.
Thank you, John. My question goes to Senator Murphy. After his eloquent statement about the re-engagement of the United States in this region, I wish to underline that in his speech or his statement, he did not mention at all the Palestinian question and Israel-Palestine conflict and the situation with the Arab world. So my question is addressed to him, whether he also supports a clear, fair engagement by the administration to broker a fair deal between the Israelis and Palestinians. This issue is so vital to us, and I hope that you got the message from the several comments that talk about Palestine and Israel. Iran is not the only controversial issue here. Israel is also on the other side of the controversy and the refusing to move ahead, perhaps encouraged by certain aspects of the administration's policy.
So we have just negotiated the way in which we will conclude this session, and the easily agreed settlement is that Senator Murphy will answer first the questions directed to him and the issues that he wishes to pick up. Congressman Wilson will then follow, and we'll close with Undersecretary Rood.
Let me do my best. Let me address the question of the Palestinian-Israeli peace process first. Please don't take my failure to articulate every American priority in the region and my unscripted opening remarks as a sign of a lack of importance or my lack of priority upon them. Listen, Secretary Rood can disagree, but I actually don't think this administration has a goal of being an honest broker. I think this administration's goal is to take sides, and it is a fundamental reorientation of the historic position of the United States with respect to the peace process. And at most moments, it looks as if this administration is acting as a political arm of the Netanyahu re-election effort rather than as an intermediary. And the worry that many of us have is that the decisions that are being made today are going to bind us in a way that will make it hard for the next administration to try to get back to that position of being an honest broker. Clearly, the belief in a two-state solution still being available as an outcome is fleeting in the West Bank and Israel, and the decisions that the administration continues to make it even harder and harder to recover. So, of course, I want the United States to get back to that role of standing between the two sides, making it clear that Israel is a sacred ally, that we stand in league with them in constructing an alignment that protects their security interests, but understanding we have to deliver hard messages to them as well as to the Palestinians if we ultimately want to get any agreement. Let me try to run through the rest of these. I'll be going to Lebanon on Monday, in part to express our continued support for a process in Lebanon that respects the rights of the people, but understands that it's got to be a multi-ethnic, inclusive government moving forward. I'm worried about some hints in the United States that we may be rethinking our support for the LAF. They are an imperfect institution, but they are worthy of continued United States economic support. I mentioned my belief that we need to make clear our long-term commitment to the people of Iraq. I would frankly prefer to see that through legislative action. We sometimes do multi-year authorizations of aid in Congress. I would like us to do that for Iraq to make it clear that at the very least the Congress wants to be there for the long run. In terms of addressing our long-term commitment in the region, listen, I think it's okay for different American politicians to have a different sense of how many troops we should have in one part of the region or another. We are always going to adjust our military presence based on needs, but I think much of our problem is that we see every problem here as a nail because all we have is a hammer. Our problem in northeast Syria was that we were sending 19-year-old Marines to do what diplomats should have been doing, right? There was a way to try to work out a governance structure in that part of the world that could have been suitable to Arab, Kurdish, and Turkish needs. But we had one diplomat in Syria for much of the time that we had 2,000 special operators there. We are going to have to create a hybrid class of diplomats and warriors, people who have political experience in these regions, who can go into very dangerous places and do that hard diplomatic work. We just don't have that capacity today. A few of our partners have that capacity. We've got to create it, so our only option isn't to send young soldiers with very little diplomatic experience in. So I think that's part of what will help us make that long-term commitment. The question of how we reinforce the value of civil service in the United States, I think, is a difficult one. I mean, this is a wild moment to watch the President of the United States attacking his own White House employees in real time as they seek to tell the truth about what happened in Ukraine. But some of these civil servants who are testifying while they are getting pilloried by the White House are also becoming heroes in the United States. There are young men and women who want to enter public service because they're seeing these individuals speak truth to power no matter the political consequences. And so you may have a rebirth of interest in people going into civil service because of what we're watching on TV today. What do we expect of our partners here? Well, I mentioned one, being realistic about the outcomes that we are trying to achieve. I do worry that by putting every issue on the table with Iran, by expecting every party that is relevant to that discussion to be at the table, we may ultimately be setting ourselves up for failure. So being realistic in what we can expect. And then understanding that to the extent possible, it is, of course, unquestionably helpful to us to have unity of purpose and action in the region. And so the continued split amongst the GCC, the inability to get Qatar back to the table as an equal partner, makes it harder for us to engage in the region. And so we hope that there's some important developments there. And then finally, this question, I think there were a number of questions about the JCPOA and what Democratic candidates may be saying about it. I'm close to many of the Democrats that are running for president today. I speak to them regularly about matters of national security and foreign policy. You are right that many of them have said that they would want to join the JCPOA without additional items being added to the negotiation. That just may not be possible in January, February, or March of 2021. That option may not be available to an American president given the trajectory of events that we are watching today. And while I certainly am open to putting other issues on the table in a limited, realistic manner, I also think we have to understand that then we have to be willing to put other items on the table. And I think that folks in this audience need to understand that those items may be unsavory. One of the things that the Iranians rightly point out is that their ballistic missiles are pointed as much at their Gulf adversaries as they are at Israel. And that they are going to want us to put on the table questions of our military support for allies here, which I think we have to be very careful about entertaining those discussions. So I just think I want us to go into any new negotiations with Iran eyes wide open. You don't get something for nothing. And if you want to put things beyond what was at in the context of the JCPOA negotiations in a new negotiation, then we need to be willing to put other items on that table as well, and that may ultimately draw us further apart. So I think we all need to be careful what we are asking for in that respect.
Senator, thank you very much indeed. Congressman.
Thank you very much. And, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. And there's actually a significant level of agreement between the senator and myself of two different parties. But I will point out that I want to restate that I believe that the actions of President Trump should be looked at by his actions, indeed overlooking maybe even some rhetoric, but how positive it was, I believe, that as we have a pivot to Asia, that doesn't mean to ignore the Middle East at all. And indeed, it was shown by having the conference immediately in Riyadh. Additionally, we have seen the success of working together to defeat ISIS across the region, and in any way that we can make sure that it does not come back, again, is so important. And then in regard to the Iran deal, I'm really grateful the actions of the President that I know that has been supported substantially by the Gulf states. Indeed, we see the success of sanctions on Iran. And we need to continue that and keep pressing forward for the benefit, really, of stability in the Middle East and, indeed, for the people of Iran itself. And then back on, I agreed so much with the Senator about missiles. We need to see that the development of missile technology in Iran is a threat to the entire world. And it's just got to be addressed. And as we look at the threat from Iran, to me, nothing should proceed without identifying the threat of new technology, which puts the entire world at risk.
Thank you. Undersecretary Rood.
Thank you. Just a few points to say in response. First, the first question by our colleague from Lebanon mentioned that the question, what is being done for people in places like Iraq and Lebanon? Is there a focus of the United States in that area? Is this something that's important? And clearly it is. And from my perspective in the defense world, unless you have stability, unless you have peace and security, the kind of economic development, the sort of development towards higher order needs is simply not possible. And so when you ask, for instance, what have we done for the people of Iraq, as I mentioned in my remarks, if we would have been sitting here just a couple of short years ago, we'd have talked about the ISIS caliphate that had spread over the territory of Iraq and much of Syria, and 7.7 million people living under that brutal rule. And so one of the tangible things that we did, again, not purely with U.S. military force, as a matter of fact, the campaign we constructed was very different. It was oriented at a by, with, and through our partners approach. And so the primary people that brought that capability, that brought that benefit to the people of Iraq, that brought that benefit from the areas of Syria that were liberated, were the local security forces, those in the Iraq security forces and those in the Syrian Democratic Forces. And the U.S. worked to enable their activities. The U.S. military worked in partnership with them, and the U.S. military did not occupy those areas. The U.S. military enabled them to control those areas. The people benefited greatly. We continue to partner with those state institutions because one of the other things that I think is important in those circumstances is there need to be trusted institutions of state that also are representative of the people, that are representative of the type of stability that we want to create. And there we have an enduring partnership with our colleagues in Iraq. It's not always easy, but quite frankly, I think we've made a lot of progress here in the last couple of years in that regard. And so, what are we doing for people? I think if you don't have security, you don't have stability, other higher order needs are simply very difficult and hard to come by. And that includes in Lebanon, where we've enjoyed a strong partnership with the Lebanese armed forces. One of the few institutions in society there that is recognized as one that is functioning and needs, of course, some capability development, needs some partnership, which we are continuing to provide. Now, another question that one of our colleagues from Australia raised was, what are the expectations that the United States would have for our partners? And here we are showing our commitment, whether that be in our willingness to stand up to aggression, our desire to deter aggression. We, as President Trump has been very clear, we don't wish to be involved in armed conflict. The goal of our military force posture, making it responsive, making it supple, bringing certain capabilities to the region and reinforcing it with the means to move quickly, is to try to preserve stability, to preserve deterrence. But in terms of our expectation of partners, we are asking our partners to do more. We're asking them to collaborate with us, to be part of things like the International Maritime Security Construct, which is devoted to freedom of navigation. A number of our partners have stepped forward to do that. I would note, since that activity began in June, the type of attacks that we saw before that period have not occurred. And so we see that as a international cooperative activity that is producing real results towards stability that benefits not only the United States, but benefits the region and beyond. And so we would ask our partners to also make commensurate contributions, to work in partnership with us. Occasionally we get at cross purposes with each other, and it undermines the effectiveness of those activities. And we'd also ask some of our more capable partners from outside the region to look at the kind of capabilities that they can bring, which not all of our partners in the region have. There are certain enabler capabilities that are in short supply, including in the United States military, for things like ISR, that we think would be particularly noteworthy that capable partners can provide. Say another question that Shashank Joshi posed was about the Iranian nuclear program. And certainly we are watching that with some very serious concern. I think it's fair to say it's been a bipartisan concern in the United States for quite some time to see the progress of that. The area where President Trump made the decision to withdraw from the JCPOA was based on a feeling that that agreement would not be effective in preventing Iran from attaining a nuclear weapon. Regrettably, the Iranians, even though they are say they are part of the agreement, not really living up to the agreement with the way that they have violated it, first in smaller ways and now in larger ways. And I think the production of material that can be later further enriched, or heavy water that can contribute to a plutonium path to a nuclear weapon, is of particular concern to us. In terms of how the U.S. policy regards that, we've said very clearly at various levels that we would regard an Iranian nuclear weapons program or an Iranian nuclear weapon as something that was unacceptable. Now, in terms of how we are approaching that, this is a diplomatic and economic approach to restraining that program. What you've seen in the maximum pressure campaign conducted by the various departments and agencies in the United States has been led by the State Department and our Treasury Department. And that's because it's an economic and diplomatic campaign. Of course, the President of the United States always retains the full suite of options in the military sphere, and it's our job in the Defense Department to make sure those are at the ready and that we are capable of carrying out the President's instructions in that regard. But, again, I'd stress the maximum pressure campaign has produced substantial results with respect to the damage it's imposed on the Iranian economy. And the goal of that is to encourage Iran's leaders to come to the negotiating table, to negotiate seriously about the nuclear program, our concerns about their missile efforts, and other things. And another thing I guess I would point out is one of our colleagues commented about the inability to surge trust, the difficulty in sending mixed messages and how that might be perceived by our friends and potential foes alike. And I think what I would say there is I resonate with that point. I think it is very important to have trusted relationships. And one of the things I tried to highlight in my remarks is just how long the United States has had those kind of trusted relationships in this region. To be sure, not every activity we have done over the years has been the smartest or wisest one. We're realistic about that. However, I would say, despite all of those things, we're very proud of our track record. There isn't any other state or anyone talking about road initiatives and things of that nature that will be able to provide that kind of partnership. And it's a partnership based, again, on a shared outlook in promoting stability, a shared partnership. Occasionally there and periodically there are periods where in our system, as for example mentioned, our colleague said, Senator Murphy said some things that disagreed with what John Rood said. That's American democracy. As a matter of fact, if you come to Washington, you'll find an awful lot more of that. and I think that's just part of the strength of what we do. So sometimes we do send different messages, but I think within that variation of messaging, though, if you look at the variation of our actions, you wouldn't see that much variation. And as I say, when the weather became stormier here, and there have been some comments about what the United States might have done differently over the last 6 months, but I will say, day after day, including today, we are standing with our partners, and you see the United States military coming to the region in larger and larger numbers because of the climate that we see, and we see the need to show our presence, show our commitment to the region, and show that we are prepared to deter and, if necessary, respond to aggression. And we certainly and sincerely hope that it doesn't come to that. The reality is we're a very busy military around the world. There are other areas where our forces are engaged. And so, it's much better to deter than to be involved in a conflict, and that is our effort. But it will take the efforts of our partners. Back to the comments of our Australian colleague. We need that genuine partnership. We need people in the region and elsewhere who have a shared outlook in promoting stability and preserving freedom of navigation to step forward with us to do that real hard work that is required. And so thank you, Dr. Chipman, again for giving us the chance to come and talk today.
Undersecretary, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Senator, Congressman. Let me just say one administrative point, and then we'll conclude the day. Just to remind the number of people who have this particular invitation, if you can make certain to be in the foyer adjacent to this ballroom at 5:45 and board the bus before 6 p.m. because you will depart before 6 p.m. And for the rest of you, if you could please warmly again thank the three speakers for their presentations and their inspiration of the debate. Thank you very much.